Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 10. December 1915. 29th of November 1915. Dear Anna, I'm fine and I'm back at the dressing station. I was only up at the front for a few weeks. One of the doctors here was getting some experience working at a regimental aid post, and they sent me and some others up with him. It wasn't so bad at the front. We got decent quarters on account of even the general staff realize it's a good idea if we're a bit less filthy than everyone else when we go sticking our fingers in wounds. They don't want the fighting men making themselves too at home, so they aren't really encouraged to improve their dugouts much. Now I'm back at the 47th and doing linen again. It's quiet work in the indoors, which is welcome because the weather's gone cold and wet, and our barn is no better. 2nd of December, 1915. Sorry I got busy and had to put this aside. Since I wrote that last bit, the ward master came out and had a look at our billet, and he's going to see what he can do about it. So that's cheered us all up a bit. If it's not impertinent for me to say, Mr. Matthew did rather well up at the front too. If it is impertinent for me to say, don't tell anyone I said it. A patrol in no man's land came a cropper, and the young officer who was leading it wasn't taking it well. I expect it was the first time he'd seen someone killed, let alone been responsible for it. Our medical officer had his hands full with the wounded, so he sent me to find another officer to help keep the first one calm. The young gentleman was wounded too, and I reckon could have made himself worse carrying on, in addition to getting in everybody's way. The officer I found was Lieutenant Colley, and he stayed and sat with the lad until we had everybody ready to send back to the dressing station. He didn't turn a hair about all the messy medical things going on, although I suppose that's natural enough given his father was a doctor, and I expect he had other things he could have been doing, so it was very decent of him to help, especially since the other officer was technically on his same level, but a lot less experienced, and not somebody he was officially responsible for. With any luck, I'll manage to be a more reliable correspondent as we get settled in for winter. The blokes who were here last winter say we can expect fewer wounds and more illnesses, which is not necessarily any less work for us, but the hours are a bit more regular. The men get a chance to report sick once a day. If they miss it, they've got to wait for the next one unless they're at death's door. So we have one busy time each day that we can plan for. Thomas.
I thought his lordship might like to hear that, Anna said. The bit about Mr. Matthew, I mean.
Mr. Bates nodded, handing the letter back to her.
I expect he would, I'll tell him. But surprising Thomas noticing something like that.
Anna had to agree. Complimenting other people was not one of Thomas's strong suits.
I suppose the war's changing him.
It does that,
Mr. Bates said.
If I'd had to guess, I'd have thought he'd be one of the ones it would change for the worse. But I'm glad I was mistaken.
Anna hesitated.
Do you suppose he's telling the truth about it not being so bad at the front?
Mr. Bates gave her a soft, sorrowful look.
I didn't really think so either,
Anna agreed. Barrow! Thomas looked up from the linen chitty. It was the same corporal who'd summoned him to the ward master the week before.
Yes? Ward master wants you?
Great. He hoped it was about the billet. The day after the ward master's surprise inspection, they'd been given a second issue of blankets and ground sheets, plus a large piece of waterproofed cloth that they hung as a canopy over the stove. It was a bit of an improvement, but everyone was wondering if that was all they were getting. On the other hand, he could very well be getting another bollocking for something somebody else had done. He couldn't think of anything at the moment, but what difference did that make? When he got to the office, the ward master waved him into a chair, which seemed a good sign.
How were things at the fucking barn?
That sounded friendly enough, but Thomas was wary. If anything had happened that the ward master would want to talk about, he didn't know what it was, but perhaps he was supposed to.
All right, Sergeant,
he said cautiously.
The extra blankets and stuff are a help. Good. My mate and the Royal Engineers went out and had a look. He says there's no point trying to fix it, the whole fucking roof's got to be replaced.
I see, said Thomas.
Boards are fucking rotten or something. You reckon some bugger nicks the slats off to fix their own roof and we're lucky what's left didn't fall down on your fucking heads.
Wasn't that a pleasant thought to go to sleep to?
I see,
he repeated.
He'll do the job, but he ain't gonna get to it anytime soon. First, he's got to get the fucking stuff together. I've got an idea or two about that. And then he's got to find a day it's not fucking raining, and he gets back a crew for an off-the-books job.
Unable to think of anything to say other than, I see, Thomas nodded. He supposed they ought to be grateful there was some end in sight to their billet troubles, but he wasn't precisely looking forward to explaining to the rest of them that they'd be putting up with it for a while longer, and that it might not be a bad idea to set a watch for imminent roof collapse.
So, here's what I came up with. It's not exactly fucking ideal, but it's all we got. The lot of you were seconded to CCS 14 for the winter.
That didn't sound so bad to Thomas. A CCS was a casualty clearing station. They were further back from the fighting than dressing stations.
They're taking on more convalescent cases while the sector's quiet, so they asked HQ for some extra men. I've got some men I've nowhere to fucking put, so...
He made a that's that sort of gesture.
Yes, Sergeant,
Thomas said.
He hesitated. What's the catch?
The fucking catch is twofold. One is that the CMO is more of an officer than a doctor. He does more fucking parades and inspections a month than ours has done all year, and anytime he feels like you're not busy enough, he has you out doing drill. You'll be alright, but the rest of that lot are going to need some sharpening up. Second, at a CCS, you got fucking nurses to deal with. You can expect that the matron will not be such a kindly and pleasant individual as your old bow the war master. I don't know her, but the woman's got to be a fucking bitch to rise that high. Don't give her any shit, and you should be alright. Make sure those other sods know it, and you'll have to watch your fucking language.
Thomas did his best to keep a straight face as he said,
Yes, Sergeant.
Yeah, there's a fucking reason I'm working this close to the lines, and while we're on the subject of fucking nurses, make sure they know there is no fucking the nurses. There won't be a problem with the senior nurses, but they've got some of those VAD girls there. All of them are young, and most of them are so fucking gently reared they've never had to say no before. You were a fucking footman, you know the type, yeah?
I do,
Thomas agreed.
So they've been told not to fucking fraternize, but they might not know what the fuck it is they're not supposed to do. Your lads are not to take advantage of the fucking ignorance.
Guardian of feminine virtue again.
I understand, Sergeant.
Maybe it was a good thing after all that they'd been a little afraid of him after he'd lost his temper, if it was now his job to keep them from doing what came naturally when faced with women they weren't paying for.
Good. Yeah.
He reached into a drawer and slapped something down on the desk. It was a corporal's stripes and papers.
Sergeant?
I wasn't planning on doing this just yet, but if I'm sending a section, I'll need to send a fucking corporal, and I'm already down 2.
He explained.
Right. The corporal from pharmacy had been demoted, and they still hadn't gotten a replacement for Diggs. Yes, Sergeant.
The fucking plan was for you to do a rotation as my clerk, then one at the collecting post. Get some practice running the squad on your own before you have a whole section to deal with, and then promote you in time for when we get new meat in the spring, but no fucking plan survives the first engagement with the fucking enemy, right?
Yes, Sergeant,
Thomas said, a little faintly. Abruptly, the events of his last few rotations rearranged themselves into a new pattern. First, they'd put him in charge of the linen room, then they put him in charge of D block, then they'd sent him to the front and put him in charge of stretcher parties. He'd known all along that they were sending Captain Allenby to get some experience at the aid post to further his development as an officer. It hadn't occurred to him that they were sending him for essentially the same reason. And Corporal Jessup, as he'd been told, was sent along as schoolmaster. But not just for Captain Allenby. It would have been nice if someone had told him what was actually going on, but he was probably a hell of a lot more prepared than poor pathetic Lieutenant Sherwood had been.
Alright then, son?
Asked the wardmaster.
Yes, Sergeant,
Said Thomas automatically.
You'll do alright, he said. And those other things we have planned, we'll do them after you get back if you fucking need them.
Yes, Sergeant.
You go in 3 days. Do your section a bit, get them to tidy up their uniforms and ask me or Jessup any questions you have, alright?
Yes, Sergeant.
You want a drink?
Yes, Sergeant.
The wardmaster laughed.
Good lad. Alright, let's have a fucking drink.
He headed over to the armchairs by the fire, saying,
I don't know if the sun's over the yardarm yet, but we're not in the fucking Navy, so we don't care.
They sat down, and the wardmaster poured them each a healthy measure of Armagnac.
Cheers.
Cheers, Thomas echoed, taking a small sip of his drink. He still had the linen chitty to finish. The wardmaster knocked back half of his.
That stuff goes on you,
he said.
Know why I started drinking it?
Thomas shook his head.
Some sort at GHQ decided only officers are allowed to buy fucker whiskey in the combat zone. God knows why, and most buggers just buy it anyways. It's not like the froggies give a fuck what GHQ has to say about it, but I figure they decide they want an excuse to come after me, they'll have to find a better one than that.
Said Thomas.
Always a good idea to drink the local hooch anyway, cheaper. And this is a damn sight better than the grog we had in South Africa. Fermented milk and God knows what. The natives said their ancestors invented the stuff after they saw elephants eat rotten fruit and get pissed off of it. And I believe it.
Thomas thought of Bates, who had come back from South Africa with a drinking problem, and wondered if the elephant liquor had anything to do with it. He took another sip of his drink, and when it didn't seem that the wardmaster had anything else to say, said, "The gentleman I used to work for fought in South Africa, and his valet."
Yeah? What regiment?
Grenadier Guards. He knew because he'd had to polish some bits and bobs that had the regimental crest on them. The wardmaster whistled.
Fuck me blind, he must be a fucking knob with knobs on.
Earl of Grantham, Thomas said.
Figured you were some kind of hot shit as a footman,
the wardmaster said.
We had you begged for some posh bugger to start.
That happens sometimes, Thomas said.
I'll bet.
The wardmaster knocked back the rest of his drink.
Better finish that and get back to fucking work, yeah? Come see me, tomorrow the hour before dinner and we'll talk some more, yeah?
Yes, Sergeant, Thomas said and finished his drink. Thank you. He nodded.
Until then, you figure out what you want to ask me and tell your lad what's going on. You're leaving Thursday, Friday morning, and you're going on the march, so pack your kits and plan your piss-ups accordingly.
Oh, great. He was going to have to tell them he was their corporal now. Yes, Sergeant. But first, he had to finish the linen chitty. He'd done it enough times now that it didn't require much conscious thought, so while he added up the columns, he thought over how much he had to do and how little time he had to do it. Just the rest of today, Wednesday, and Thursday, and they all had their regular work to do, so everything extra, packing up their kits, smartening up their uniforms, drill, would have to be fitted into the mornings and evenings. Dinner would be the first chance he had to talk to everybody at once, so he'd have to explain things then. He could tell them to check their kits tonight, and then inspect their uniforms tomorrow before they reported for duty. That would give them enough time to fix anything that needed it. He'd have liked to get started on drill tomorrow too, but he wasn't sure how to start. Apart from lining up for parades, and that only a handful of times, he hadn't so much as thought about drill since leaving England. And he never really understood how Form 4s worked. It seemed like a magic trick the way you started out in 2 rows and without anybody taking more than 2 steps, ended up in 4 columns. He'd have to find a drill manual somewhere and make time to read it. So he'd manage that tomorrow, somehow. If all else failed, he could ask the wardmaster for a manual and then drill Thursday morning. Maybe tomorrow night, too, if there wasn't too much work to be done on kits and uniforms. And they could get in some more practice on the march there. All right, so there was just about enough time for everything if they didn't mess around. Those thoughts took him through filling out the rest of the chitty, and then it was time to go outside to smoke a cigarette and wait for the linen van. Rollins turned up, as he sometimes did. Thomas half listened as he chattered about what was happening on his ward, nothing unusual, and wondered whether he ought to tell Rollins the news. Might it be best to tell everyone at once? He didn't want to seem like he was playing favorites. On the other hand, if he didn't say anything, Rollins was going to wonder why he hadn't. It didn't seem a good idea to start out as corporal with another quarrel. He made up his mind when Rollins said, "Any idea what you're doing next rotation?" There. If anyone wanted to know why he told Rollins first, he could say, "Because he asked." Yeah, actually. Wardmaster called me in a bit ago. Rollins looked over at him, his expression worried. Yeah. We're all being seconded to the 14th CCS for the winter. Fuck me, said Rollins. You mean all of us from the barn? Thomas nodded. Apparently it's not going to be fixed quickly, and they need some extra men, so...
He shrugged. Well, Rollins said slowly, that might be all right. We won't have to do carrying parties up to our arses in snow. True. Thomas took a drag from his cigarette. There's another thing. What? Thomas took out his pay book, where he'd put his stripes for safekeeping until he had a chance to sew them on. Angling it toward Rollins, he opened the cover and showed them to him. Christ! Said Rollins. Oh, those are yours? No, I nicked them off his desk. What do you think? Rollins shook his head. Well, it's about fucking time. How long have you been at Lance Corporal? Not that long, said Thomas. He wondered whether to admit that the wardmaster had told him he was promoting him ahead of schedule. Probably not. It wasn't the sort of information that would inspire confidence. I guess they needed a corporal to send with the section. You'll be brilliant, Rollins said. We should go out and celebrate. We don't have a lot of time, Thomas said. We go Friday morning. Figured I'd tell everyone at dinner tonight. All right, then we go tomorrow night, Rollins said. Maybe, said Thomas. We have a lot to do. Like what? Like pack our kits and make sure we have everything we need, and go over our uniforms. The Warmaster says the CMO there is a real hard ass. The linen van was pulling into the courtyard. Great. Thomas tossed away his cigarette. I'll explain at dinner. If you see any of the others, make sure they know I need to talk to everybody, all right? Rollins nodded. All right, I better get back to. Congratulations! Thomas was back in the NCO's room after the linen distribution when Jessup came in. There you are, lad. Dooley just told me. Did he? It felt a bit strange that he'd known about this development before Jessup did. It's a little quicker than we planned, but you'll be all right, he said. It's a shame I won't be right on hand if you need a bit of advice, but you just write me if you need anything. I will. Thanks. Say, do you know where I can find a drill manual? Drill manual? What do you want that for? Woolmaster says the MCO at the new place likes drilling. Figured I'd better brush up. Oh, aye, that's not a bad idea. Let me think. There must be one lying around somewhere. He looked around the room as though expecting one to jump up and start dancing around. Pumblight, have you got a drill manual? He asked one of the sergeants. What for? Barrow needs one. Purbright rummaged through a door. Well, I suppose he could look at mine, but he can't have it. He held it out, and Thomas went over and got it. Thanks. Put it back on my desk as soon as you're done with it. Thomas spent what was left of the afternoon reviewing the drill manual, and with the aid of a dozen paperclips, working out the trick behind Form 4s. Once he could get his paperclips to do it correctly without looking at the book, he experimented with all the ways they could get it wrong and how to fix them without starting over. Along the way, he also discovered the positions in the section where he could put his least reliable paperclips, where the only thing they'd have to do was face right. The paperclip named Plank might have trouble with even that much, but it would have to do. After that, he had only enough time left to review some of the most basic commands. Attention, stand easy, and the like. He figured those were the most likely to come up, but if they had to do anything really difficult, they were screwed. Countermarching, for instance. He'd forgotten that existed, and it was an even bigger mystery than Form 4s. By the time he'd returned the book to Purbright's desk and headed over to the mess, everyone else was already there. Well, said Manning when he sat down. What? Asked Thomas, helping himself to stew. Rollins says you had some big announcement, Perkins said. Thomas realized that he had been sort of hoping that Rollins would have already let the cat out of the bag. Yeah, he said. I'll do. He must have sounded grimmer about it than he meant to, because everyone exchanged nervous looks, and Collins asked hesitantly, Are they sending us to the front? Fuck no! CCS-14, Thomas said. They're sending us to CCS-14. Oh, said Collins. That's all right then. There were a few minutes of crosstalk about CCS-14 and why they were being sent there. Thomas took the opportunity to eat while everyone else was talking, and when it died down a little, he said, 2 reasons. 1, CCS-14 asked for extra men, and 2, it's going to be a while before the Woolmaster can get our barn fixed up. Why do they need extra men anyway? Rollins asked. He didn't say. And it's all of us this time? Manning asked. You're sure it's not just you again? Yeah, said Thomas. It's all of us.
He hesitated.
And I'm your corporal now. He shoved a fork full of stew into his mouth to give himself time to think before answering any follow-up questions, but he needn't have bothered. Everyone started talking at once, and if any of them said anything of substance, Thomas didn't hear it. Fuck! About time. Not going to let us get away with anything, is he?
Who else would it be? Oh, magnificent Boston.
Thomas was waiting for them all to pipe down so that he could explain the plan for the next few days, but before he could, Rollins said,
So we have to go out and celebrate, yeah?
There was general agreement with this plan and discussion of which estaminet they should repair to and whether the men on ward duty could foist their evening chores off on somebody else. He took advantage of the first slight pause to say,
If you want, but we have a lot to do. The Warmaster says that the CMO at the new place is a real military type. We have to get our uniforms in shape and brush up on drill. We leave Friday morning, so there isn't a lot of time. Tonight I want to work on going over our kits and uniforms, so to start with.
The pronouncement did not quite have the effect that Thomas was hoping for. Instead of asking any intelligent questions about what they needed to do with their kits or what they were going to do about drill, everyone started talking about where they would go tomorrow night and the effect that this plan of change might have on the ability of the men on wards to get away early.
Lily's, definitely, said Manning. I'm finally getting somewhere with that girl with the black hair. It'll break her heart if she doesn't know where I've gone.
There'll be girls where we're going, Rollins pointed out. Lots of them probably. It's to the rear.
Wait, said Perkins. It's a CCS. Are there nurses?
Yes, said Thomas. And the wardmaster had a bit to say about that too.
Now they were all ears.
First of all, Thomas said, he says we've got to clean up our fucking language.
That got the expected laugh.
Second, there is no fucking the fucking nurses. They might be doing the same kind of work we are, but they're not our sort. They're young ladies. It's the officers who are their own kind, not us. You call them Nurse Smith or Sister Jones. Don't talk to them about anything except your duties and pretend like their uniforms are built in.
He looked around the room.
Whose mum had a China shepherdess?
Several people admitted that their mums had such an article. Mine's was a milkmaid, said Blank.
Same thing, Thomas said. You ever try and look up a skirt?
You can't, said Blank. It's all in one piece.
Exactly, said Thomas. You look at them nurses, you think China shepherdess. Or milkmaid, as the case may be. Between her face and her feet, there's just a dress. You want to look at a real live girl? Go to an estaminet.
What if they can't resist my manly charms?
Said Manning. Thomas didn't think he had much to worry about on that score, but said only,
They've been warned off fraternizing with us too. And the other thing to keep in mind is that instead of a ward master, they'll have a matron and ward sisters instead of ward sergeants. Anybody here ever worked for a woman before?
Does Mum count? Asked Perkins.
No, said Thomas. Ward master says they have to be tough to get to that level, so don't give them any crap.
Thomas thought about the various tricks he'd seen hall boys try on Miss Patmore and Miss Hughes.
Don't try to flatter your way around them, or argue with them, or give them any back chat. Just say yes, matron, no, matron, right away, matron, or yes, sister, as the case may be. Understood?
Yes, matron,
said Manning. Rollins thumped him across the back of the head.
Thank you, Rollins, Thomas said. If you think taking orders from a woman is a joke, you will learn to regret it. He moved back to the main topic. Enough about the nurses. We want to make a good impression when we get there, right?
People nodded and said things like, sure, yeah,
I guess.
So we have to be as ready as we can be. Tonight, go over your kit. If you need to draw anything from stores, do it tomorrow. And we're going on the march, so if you've accumulated more than you can carry, now's the time to figure out where you're going to leave it.
More nods and murmurs of agreement.
Tomorrow we're getting up half an hour early for uniform inspection. If you're planning on going out tomorrow night, there'd best not be much you need to fix. Thursday morning, we're doing drill. Thursday night, polish boots and brass. Friday morning, we go. It's a little tight, but as long as we don't mess around, we should be alright.
Everyone looked at him for a moment. Finally, Manning said,
Are you fucking serious, mate?
Corporal, said Thomas.
What?
Are you fucking serious? Corporal, he repeated. And yes, I am. Unless you think it's a good idea that we show up to a new posting looking like a bunch of slovenly fuck-ups.
Well, said Rollins, when you put it like that.
There were a few murmurs of agreement, but not very enthusiastic ones. Thomas sighed. Don't mess about, and I'll stand the first round tomorrow night, alright?
That information was slightly better received, but Thomas wondered if it had been a mistake. He couldn't imagine Carson, for instance, offering anybody a bribe to do what they were told. Since he'd spent most of the meal talking, Thomas was still eating his dinner when the rest of them began drifting away, either back to the wards for their evening tasks, or in search of someplace warm and dry to pass the time before returning to the barn. Soon it was just him and Manning, who had long finished his meal, but seemed in no hurry to go anywhere.
Did he say why it was you?
Manning asked suddenly.
Who?
The War Master. Why he picked you for corporal?
Oh, no, we didn't say.
Only some of us have been here a lot longer. Rollins, Applegate,
And Manning.
Blank,
Thomas said.
It was never going to be blank.
True. True.
It wasn't, Thomas thought, all that likely to have been Manning either. Probably Rollins, if it wasn't him. Still, he knew this one from the other side, although he could barely dimly remember what it had been like to want to be a valet like it was his hope of heaven. And he knew it mattered, what he said.
He says something about doing it a bit earlier than he planned because he's down 2 corporals.
That was true. He had said that.
And he mentioned more new blokes coming in the spring.
Also true.
He might be planning more promotions then.
The Wardmaster hadn't said that, but it might be true. And more importantly, if Manning believed he was in with a chance, he wouldn't want to make trouble.
Did he say who he's looking at?
No. If he thought the answer might be yes, Thomas would have asked if the Wardmaster had given Manning any special assignments like he had Thomas. But he was fairly sure that if Manning had been given anything with a bit of extra responsibility to it, he'd have said something about it. Thomas would have before, back when he still cared about things like that.
He didn't say anything about anyone else,
Thomas continued.
I don't reckon he'd think it was any of my business. He just mentioned the new spring drafts in passing like.
Manning nodded.
Right.
He stood up.
Guess I'll go get started on my kit then.
Good idea. I'll be along soon.
Manning left, leaving behind his plate and things. Honestly, Thomas thought as he gathered them up along with his own and put them in the washing up bin. If he wants to know why he's not a bloody corporal. When he got back to the barn, Thomas found Manning and several of the others going over their kits. Fortunately, he had no idea what he'd do if they weren't. It was for a change not raining, so he spread out his ground sheet and methodically laid out all of his own things on it. He didn't have much that wasn't standard issue. A biscuit tin with his letters in, a small shaving mirror, his sewing kit, his cigarette case. He stood up abruptly, his eyes stinging, and went outside. Rollins wasn't back yet, thank God, although he might have learned his lesson about following Thomas outside when he wanted to be alone. The cigarette case felt like it was burning in his hand as he walked over to the rubble of the bombed-out house and sat on his rock. Deliberately not thinking about what he was doing, he opened the case and took out a cigarette and lit it with Peter's lighter. It was stale, of course. He'd bought that pack back in England 6 months ago. Or 6 centuries, maybe. Taking a deep drag from it, he propped the cigarette case open on his knee, held the lighter's flame in front of it, and looked at Peter.
I'm a corporal now,
Thomas told him.
Like you. If I came here to take your place, I've done it.
Peter, of course, didn't say anything. Because he was dead. A sound escaped him like the whine of an injured dog. In a single motion, he put out the lighter, closed the case, and stuffed both into his greatcoat pocket. There was a reason he kept it at the bottom of his pack.
Plank,
Thomas said with a sigh.
Is there a reason your top button isn't buttoned?
Yeah, said Plank. It fell off, didn't it? At least he knew he'd been right not to leave this until the last minute.
Did you lose it?
He asked, holding onto his patience with both hands. No, said Plank proudly. It's right. He began patting his pockets, finally finding it in the inside one. Yeah.
Is there a reason you haven't sewn it back on?
My mum does all me sewing, Plank explained. And she isn't it, is she?
Thomas briefly considered trying to explain the flaw in Plank's logic, but gave it up as a bad job.
Bring it to me later and I'll show you how to do it, alright?
He moved on to the next one in line, which was Manning.
Your hair wants cutting too. He had already made the same observation to Rollins and Cadman.
Collins was alright, so was Applegate.
Perkin, your punties are on backwards.
Perkins looked down at his legs.
What? You're meant to wrap them clockwise.
I'm left-handed, Perkins explained.
So what? Honestly, was he going to salute with the wrong hand too?
I've been doing them this way all along, Perkins added.
Then you've been doing them wrong all along, Thomas said. Start doing them correctly tomorrow.
Liston also had bunty troubles.
You're stepping them up too much. Each time you go around, you should overlap by half the width.
If I do that, I run out of bunty before I run out of leg, Liston explained. I've got long shanks, me.
Oh, for God's sake. Then lengthen them. Get another one and sew some extra on.
Liston opened his mouth and Thomas added,
I'll show you how after I help Plank with his button.
Finally, Morris had a large and poorly mended tear on one sleeve. Thomas supposed he deserved some credit for making an effort, but honestly, it looked like a 2-year-old had done it.
I'll show you how to fix that too. Come find me at tea break. Plank and Liston, you two, and anyone else who's been waiting for Mum to turn up to do your mending.
Stepping back, Thomas glanced at his watch. They still had a few minutes before they had to leave.
All right, let's see if anybody remembers this. Then, chun!
With a number of sidelong glances, they all shuffled more or less to attention. All except one, anyway.
Plank!
Plank looked up brightly.
Look at the bloke next to you.
Plank did so, then looked back at Thomas. He did not, however, change his position, which was at ease, not attention.
Now look at the bloke on the other side.
Plank looked again, his expression growing confused.
Do you notice a difference between what they're doing and what you're doing?
Slowly, Plank dropped his hands to his sides and brought his heels together.
Good.
Meanwhile, of course, everyone else had fallen out of attention to watch the show.
Let's try it again, and this time pretend like you're taking it seriously.
He took them through attention, stand easy, at ease, and back again, learning as he did so that while Plank was the only one badly confused about attention, several others had forgotten the difference between the latter two, which mainly had to do with where to put your hands. Clearly they had their work cut out for them, at least when he announced that they'd assemble the next morning at 500 for drill, and nobody asked if he was fucking serious. Although, as they were walking to the station, Rollins asked,
Are you planning to ease up a bit once we get there?
It was fairly obvious that the answer he was looking for was yes. But Thomas said,
Depends on how we measure up when we get there.
Rollins nodded.
I guess. They won't know us there, Thomas pointed out. We want to make a good first impression, don't we? Of course, but what? This stuff doesn't come as easy to everybody as it does to you.
Thomas scoffed.
What makes you think it comes easy?
Rollins looked him up and down. When that failed to enlighten Thomas, he asked,
How do you even notice when somebody's panties are wrapped the wrong way round?
How do you not?
Admittedly, it had taken a moment of close examination to figure out precisely what the problem was, but he'd noticed ages ago that Perkins always had something wrong with his panties.
That's what I mean!
Thomas shrugged.
I guess it's something you pick up being a footman.
Especially if the butler couldn't stand you.
Half the job is being looked at, and the other half is being invisible.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, if you don't do it right, the butler gets sarcastic about it. I can't even imagine what he'd do if one of us showed up with a button missing.
FP?
Rollins suggested.
Only since they outlawed flogging.
Now that I thought about it, Plank would never have had the chance to lose the button in the first place. It was clear enough how he'd done it. He was always tugging at his collar. Carson would have knocked him over the first time he saw him do it. When Thomas got to the NCO's room after breakfast, he found 2 books sitting on his desk. A drill manual and the RAMC training manual. Stuck inside the drill manual was a note. The RAMC one's got stretcher drill in it. WT. Suddenly, Thomas remembered that his cigarette case was still in his greatcoat pocket. He never put it back in his pack.
But why hadn't he thought of that now? And more to the point, who the fuck was W.T.? Nobody in the section had a surname starting with T. Not that it would make sense for any of them to be leaving books on his desk. It had to be one of the NCOs. One of the other NCOs, he corrected himself. He mentally ran through their names. Oh, right. To thee. Was it W for Wardmaster, or did he actually have a Christian name? And that was why he thought of a cigarette case. The only letters he got now were from people who didn't care who knew they had written them. He didn't get letters signed with initials anymore because all of the people who had written them were dead. Except for Theo, maybe. Lad! Thomas spun around to see Jessup looking at him with an expression of concern. You all right? Jessup asked. Thomas nodded.
Fine. I was just wondering if the Wardmaster's got a Christian name.
He showed Jessup the note.
Welcome,
Jessup said.
but you didn't hear it from me.
Huh. I didn't even think about stretcher drill,
Thomas said.
There's no way we'll have time to practice that before we go.
It'd be a nasty trick to pull that on you the moment you get there,
Jessup said.
Don't bite off more than you can chew. It'll be more the sergeant's job to get you all back in top form, and that's what the officer expects. You just want to get him used to hearing orders from you.
Didn't think of it that way,
Thomas admitted. In that case, they were making a bit of progress.
And tidied up enough you reflect well on us, of course.
Jessup added. During the day, Thomas got through his work with the linen quickly. It really wasn't that difficult if you did it systematically, and spent as much time as he could with the manual. The drill manual had a bit toward the beginning that explained why drill was important, and it made much the same point that Jessup had. Drill maneuvers, it said, weren't terribly relevant to modern warfare, and were even less relevant to modern medical work, but they taught the men habits of discipline, as well as working together as a unit. They could certainly use that. Technically, they had always been a section, Section E of Platoon 4, but they were always split upon duty, assigned in 1s or 2s to other sections. They paraded together, but there had only been a handful of parades since they'd been here, most of them very informal, like the one announcing Lamble's death. But they weren't really new lads anymore, and it wouldn't be surprising if, at the new place, they were worked as a section. Returning to the book, Thomas had more trouble believing its claim that the habits of discipline and coordination would translate to conditions of actual battle. He could think of nothing less similar to the screaming nightmare of actual combat, what little he'd seen of it, than the orderly calm of a parade ground. But he supposed that for the likes of them, all that mattered was that the men in the brass hats thought it did. It was even harder to contain his scorn when he looked up stretcher drill in the RAMC manual, and it read about using 6 bearers to pick up a single wounded man and carry him across open level ground. It was only with difficulty that Thomas could remember a time he'd used as many as 4. The patient had been an officer the approximate size and weight of a fully grown bull. As instructed, Thomas reported to the wardmaster's office before dinner. The wardmaster was already sitting in front of the fire with the bottle out, which took some of the guesswork out of figuring out what kind of conversation this was going to be.
So,
The wardmaster said, pouring Thomas a drink and handing it to him.
First day's a fucking corporal. How'd it go?
He topped up his own glass.
All right, said Thomas. I checked over everyone's uniforms and helped them with some mending. We'll do a bit of drill tomorrow. Good, good. You got the books?
Yes, thanks. Can I take them with me? There's a lot I need to review.
Yeah, keep 'em.
He tossed back his drink and poured another one.
All right. So what do you need to know about being a corporal?
Thomas had forgotten that he was supposed to be thinking about questions to ask, but fortunately the wardmaster rolled on.
1.
He said, holding up one finger.
Don't ask your lads to do anything you won't do yourself. You already know that one, but it's important. You don't always have to take the worst job going, but if you always manage to be doing something else when there's scot work to be done, they'll notice. What you did on night duty was about right. Rotate the lighter jobs with the harder ones and take your turn on both.
Thomas hadn't been thinking of it quite that way at the time. He'd been thinking more of not having the other 3 at his throat. But he supposed it was a similar sort of thing.
All right. 2. You know this one too. Your lads fuck up, you're the one who gets your arse wringed out. Don't bother saying you didn't know, or you couldn't stop them, because now it's your job to know and stop them. Take it like a man, then turn around and give it back to the one what done it.
Now that one he really did know, although having official sanction to pass along whatever he got to the genuinely responsible party was a bit of a novelty.
Like that shit show down in the pharmacy section. The corporal there was part of it, but even if he hadn't been, he'd still be in the fucking shit. You best believe that if the CMO had found out about it from anybody other than me, I'd be in the shit too. So that's number 3. If this fuck up's bad enough, you've got to pass it up the chain fast enough the shit don't stick on you. Now that one's a real son of a bitch, especially when it's your mates, because you don't drop your mates in the shit. And that goes double when you're responsible for them. It's your job to protect them from the consequences of their own fucking stupidity, right up to the point where it isn't.
That was a difficult one. How do you tell when you should cover for them or not?
The wardmaster topped up his glass and Thomas's as well.
You figure it out, you tell me. No, first of all, you're not covering for them exactly. Put a fucking pin in that, we'll come back to it. Like that fucking shit show with Diggs. We talked about that, didn't we?
We did, Thomas said. It seemed like ages ago, even though it had only been a few months.
I let too much of a shit slide, and it came back to bite me on the arse. We came up together, him and me and Jessup. Think you and the Rollins lad, and I don't know, who's the biggest fuck up in your section?
Plank, obviously.
Sergeant?
Yeah, you don't have to answer that. Point of advice, if a superior officer asks you to drop one of your lads in the shit, you can ask him to make it an order if he really wants to know. But if he does, then you've got to say. Where was I?
Thanks, Sergeant.
Right, so my point is, it's not easy to tell when it's time to hang some fuck up out to dry. If we were doing this the way we planned, I'd say ask Jessup. There's probably somebody at the fucking 14th you can ask, but you'll have to figure out who. And you don't want to go asking for help with every fucking thing. You know that one too.
He paused and lit a cigarette, thinking for a moment.
When you want to hang one of your lads out to dry is when he's fucking up bad enough, it's hurting the rest of your lads. Not just getting them killed, I mean, but if other blokes can't do their fucking job, that's when you start to think about cutting your fucking losses. You follow me?
I think so, said Thomas. If he's doing more harm than good, like.
Yeah. 'Cause your job, your real fucking job, is to look out for your lads. Sometimes you're protecting them from the fucking enemy, sometimes you're protecting them from the fuckers in the brass arts, and sometimes you're protecting them from themselves. And that's... What was the thing I said we'd come back to?
Thomas thought back.
Not covering for them exactly.
Right. There's a difference between covering shit up and keeping it in the fucking family. You want to handle the small shit yourself before it comes to the attention of some Rupert with no sense of fucking proportion. Like that little pissant out of the 8 post who got his patrol shot to ribbons. Now, it does not do anybody one bit of fucking harm if Jessup calls young Allenby young Allenby, or if I call the little pissant a little pissant. But if you were saying it, I'd do something about it, because I'd rather thump you myself than see you tie to a fucking post, yeah?
Yeah,
Thomas nodded.
that makes sense.
He hesitated.
Could Corporal Jessup have gotten FP for that?
He thought having to stand there and listen to Sherwood berate him was bad enough.
Depends on whether or not the review board had a sense of fucking proportion,
said the War Master.
They'd have had to bust him down to private first. NCOs can't get FP, and it'd be a fucking hard review board that would go that far.
Thomas said, one of the blokes from the idea said he'd been a corporal for a bit before he called a young officer a gobshite. That seems a bit worse than what Jessup said.
No army bloke.
Thomas nodded.
Yeah, they're a bit quicker to bust back a lad who just made rank than a career NCO like Jessup. He a working class lad.
His dad was a miner,
Thomas said,
but he was training for a doctor before the war.
Fuck me blind,
said the War Master.
They'd have wanted to put him in his place, and no mistake. You probably noticed most of the new army corporals we've got around here are what passes for fucking posh among us other ranks.
I did, yes.
They get a fucking leg up on account of how they know how to talk to officers. That's why we were so fucking excited to find out you weren't actually the posh gate we took you for. I don't mind moving the posh buggers up the ranks if they deserve it, but a proper working class lad we could push up the ladder, that's something to write home about.
He shook his head.
A fucking footman. It's perfect.
So that was the answer to Manning's question, sort of. It was just as well he hadn't known when Manning had asked. Though as far as Thomas was concerned, it was about time somebody got some advantage out of being working class.
So yeah,
The War Master went on.
if you get into any shit that really fucking matters, you bust that straight upstairs. You're a corporal, so right now that usually just means to your sergeant or maybe the ward sister. They'll decide if it needs to go up into officer's country. When it comes to the penny ain't shit. Your job is to catch it before it gets to the sergeant. And if you miss it, his job is to catch it before it gets to the fucking Ruperts.
He lit another cigarette.
Which way does shit roll?
Downhill, Sergeant, Thomas said.
Right. And the further up it starts, the more fucking momentum it picks up. Sometimes you have to give your lads shit so they don't get it from anybody else.
That made sense, and was a far cry from being accused of bullying poor William for saying what Carson would say if Thomas hadn't gotten to it first.
So, what can I actually do to them, if I need to? Officially, as a corporal, you're limited to verbal fucking reprimands. Unofficially, you can assign them to the worst jobs going, and make sure they know why. And you can do drills and inspections whenever the fuck you want, so you can use that. Putting them on report is the last fucking resort. And you don't want to bang on about that all the time, or it gets to sound like, just wait till Dad comes home.
That was about what Thomas had thought.
All right. I think I can manage that.
Oh, no, you can't,
said the Ward Master.
We're doing this ahead of schedule, like I said. But if I didn't think you could do it, I'd have come up with something else.
Oh, that was unexpected. Thomas took a sip of his drink to cover his momentary flat-footedness.
Yes, Sergeant, I'll do my best.
I'll know that too.
The War Master went on to talk about a few more things, mostly practicalities to do with the march to CCS 14. Most of them had been there before at one time or another, accompanying wounded or getting supplies or things like that, but this time, Thomas would be responsible for making sure they all got there together and on time. The place wasn't hard to find. You followed the biggest and most well-traveled road leading rearward from the station, but the Ward Master gave him a map.
Pick your spots for halts. You can change them on the march if you need to, but it's better when the lads start grumbling about how isn't it time for a break, if you can tell them how much farther it is to the stopping place. And then stick to it unless there's a damn good reason not to.
That made sense. Thomas had always hated it when he got to the end of a job and was looking forward to his cigarette, and Carson turned up with some new thing that had to be done right away. After a few more details, the Ward Master said,
About time we were getting to the fucking mess, I should think.
He was right, and Thomas was a bit impressed, given that the only clock in the room was behind the Ward Master's back, and he had been drinking steadily for at least an hour.
Yes, Sergeant,
he said, quickly finishing his drink.
You know you're entitled to eat with the NCOs now, son,
the Ward Master added.
Yes.
Great.
The lads were planning to go out tonight. Celebrate a bit.
God only knew what the others would think if he didn't show up to his own celebration. But if the Ward Master wanted him in the NCO's mess, that's where he'd have to be.
Right. Tomorrow then. Better fuck off before your mates start thinking I've eaten you.
Thomas fucked off and found several of the others milling around outside the mess.
Where have you been?
Asked Perkins.
The Wolf Master wanted to talk to me. Is this everybody?
Rollins and Applegate went ahead to get at the table,
Manning said.
He decided to let us in on that secret place you two are always going.
He didn't go there all that often, but Thomas didn't argue. He was glad enough to be going to Granny's. The place Manning liked had terrible food and worse wine. Arriving at the estaminet, they found that Rollins and Applegate had for some time been vigorously defending a large table against an artillery crew and were beginning to lose ground. Fortunately, the reinforcements turned up just in time, and the artillerymen fell back in the face of superior numbers.
Can't say I think much of the talent,
Manning said when the elderly waiter brought their first round, which Thomas paid for, as promised.
We come here for the food,
Rollins explained.
What do they have?
Perkins asked. Thomas, filling glasses from the wine jug, said,
Plat de jour, or egg and chips, if you're a coward.
Egg and chips was standard estaminet fare. Granny had started offering it a while ago.
What's bloody George?
Asked Blank.
It's French for dish of the day,
Thomas explained.
Whatever the old lady can get. It's always good.
I don't like foreign food,
Blank said.
And isn't there any beer?
Thomas shrugged.
I don't know. Ask the gaffer when he comes back. But French beer is shite.
The plat du jour was the chicken stew that Rollins had rhapsodized about the first time they came here. Thomas had never gotten to try it before, so he was doubly glad they'd come here. Most of the others plumped for the special as well, although a few, including Plank, went for the egg and chips. They did look like pretty good chips. Beyond that, Thomas retained few impressions of the night. He prided himself on his ability to hold his drink, but thanks to the wardmaster, he had started the evening at least 2 drinks ahead of everyone else, and by the 3rd or 4th round, about the time they decamped to the estaminet where Manning's black-haired girl worked, it was beginning to show. When on the way there, the subject of buying him a girl arose, he was unable to marshal the mental resources to come up with a plausible objection. Fortunately, the plan foundered against the hard fact that none of them really had enough money for such an undertaking, and he ended up instead with an astonishingly filthy postcard.
Is that a carrot?
Asked Perkins.
Maybe,
said Thomas, holding it up to the light. Could be a parsnip. Parsnips were skinnier toward the bottom than carrots, but where this one was, you could only see the thick end of it.
She's got nice tits, though,
Manning pointed out. If he said so. They staggered home at some hour only slightly less obscene than the postcard, and when the alarm went, Thomas was not any more eager to get up and do drill than anyone else. It seemed monstrously unfair that not only did he have to get up without anyone shouting at him to do it, he had to do the shouting for everyone else. Drill was a shit show, of course. His newfound understanding of Form 4s had been washed out of his brain on a tide of cheap wine, and after a lot of confused milling about, on their best attempt, half of them ended up facing the wrong way. Thomas had to get the book out and read the instructions aloud. Once they had finally achieved it, they only had a few minutes left before reporting to the station for breakfast. Thomas decided to use it to practice saluting, which ought to have been easy enough, but he had them standing too close together, and several people had to dodge the elbow of the man next to them.
Right,
he said.
We'll try this again tomorrow. Dismissed.
Thomas did manage to perk up a bit over breakfast, though doing the linen chitty took him a lot longer than usual. Some of the columns he had to add up 2 or 3 times before he got a number that made sense. It wasn't a big surprise that Rollins didn't turn up when he was waiting for the van. He was likely having the same kind of day Thomas was, and ward work wasn't as generous in its allowance of time for each task as linen duty was. It was, however, a little surprising that Captain Allenby showed up instead.
There you are. One of the others said you were usually here at about this time. Yes, sir. Waiting for the linen delivery. I heard about the,
He gestured at Thomas's new stripes.
Congratulations. Thank you, sir. And you're going to the 14th. I envy you. They're doing some exciting work there with shell shock.
Are they, sir? Allenby nodded. The idea is to treat the milder cases without taking them out of the combat zone.
It gives the men the idea that an episode of shell shock is like a fever or dysentery. It might happen to anyone, and most recover quickly and without complications. Sending them back to England for special treatment only convinces them that they're seriously ill.
Like the trick with the phony blind man, sir?
Perhaps. Though there's quite a bit of truth to it as well. If the problem is that the man's been under too much strain, adding the fear that he's gone permanently mad and is destined to be a burden to his family will only worsen his troubles. If he knows that he's expected to get better, that's one less thing for him to worry about.
Thomas could see the point of that. Hadn't he wondered, after his funny turn the night Lamble had died, if he was a coward like Diggs? Jessup's treating it as perfectly ordinary had likely helped.
I see, sir. They're setting up special wards for shell shock, and they'll be taking cases from all over the 4th Army area. Allenby added, the hope is that by having a group of them in one place, they'll see other men with similar troubles getting better, and that will help them get better too.
Now that Thomas wasn't so sure about. Cowardice was contagious. Everybody knew that.
What if they just give each other more things to worry about? He asked. Sir. They may, Captain Allenby admitted. Some other medical officers have expressed that very concern. But what we've been doing hasn't worked especially well, so they're trying different approaches in different areas.
Well, he supposed anything was better than lining the poor beggars up and shooting them.
Yes, sir. In any case, it should be interesting. I hope you'll tell me what you think when you get back, if they have you working on the shell shock wards at all. Yes, sir. Oh, there's the landing van. Oh, get out of your hair. Congratulations again, and good luck!
Things had been hectic in Rollins' ward that day, and by the time he got to the mess for dinner, most of the others were already there. They fell ominously silent when Rollins joined them. He dug into his stew and waited for someone to say something. It was Manning who finally did. No surprise there.
What's your take on the Barrow situation?
Mostly, Rollins wondered if what they were seeing was what it was like inside Barrow's head all the time. Just a constant litany of everything the rest of them were doing wrong. But that wouldn't be what Manning was asking about. What do you mean? Before Manning could answer, Perkins said,
Doubtless more tactfully than Manning would have.
He's taking this corporal thing pretty seriously.
He was, but Rollins wouldn't have expected anything different.
He wants us to make a good impression when we get to the new place,
he pointed out. Barrow had told them all exactly that the night before last. But it didn't seem a good idea to remind them that what Barrow had actually said was that they didn't want to look like slovenly fuck-ups. Rollins had assumed at the time that he was exaggerating, but by now he was starting to wonder if that was exactly what Barrow thought they were. Manning snorted.
He's got a man with power is what he's done.
He'd been right about the tact then.
He's probably nervous. Being corporal all of a sudden.
Rollins said, not that Barrow gave any sense of being nervous, or of feeling anything at all, really. Does Barrow get nervous?
Plank wondered.
Fuck if I know,
Rollins answered. He knew the others had him pegged for just about Barrow's best mate, but Rollins sometimes wondered if Barrow thought they were. He couldn't help remembering poor Lamb, too dumb to realize Barrow was only just barely putting up with him.
I know I would be.
Manning scoffed.
What's to be nervous about? We all know our jobs, whether he thinks we do or not.
Rollins decided not to point out that they'd all been happy enough to unanimously elect Barrow to do something about this billet situation on the strength of his being Lance Corporal. Now that he was a full corporal, if he wanted to run drill and carpet them about their uniforms, that just might be the price they paid for not having to do things like convince the wardmaster their billet really was unlivable. Taking a page from Barrow's book, Rollins sat back and listened as they all groused for a while about how they didn't know their jobs and who cared about things like Plank's top button anyway. He sat up and took notice, though, when, as they were all just about finished eating, Manning said,
So, are we actually going to let him make us drill again when we go off duty tonight?
For a long moment, no one said anything. Rollins was starting to wonder if he was going to have to, when Collins said,
Not sure we really have a choice, mate. He does outrank us now.
What's he going to do if we all say no? We're not fucking doing it.
Manning argued. Rollins thought back to when they'd been talking about the billet. What was it Barrow had said?
I'm pretty sure that could be considered mutiny.
Manning scoffed again, but began to look a little doubtful.
Technically, yeah, Collins agreed. Anyway, we're leaving for the CCS tomorrow. Really not a good time to be fighting amongst ourselves, is it?
There were some murmurs of agreement at that, and Rollins added,
He'll probably ease off once we get there. Either he'll see that our uniforms look just as good as anybody else's, or we'll be too busy to bother about that stuff.
Collins nodded.
Let's give it some time,
he suggested to Manning.
If it gets worse, we'll figure something out.
Everyone looked pretty relieved to have a solution that didn't require an immediate confrontation with Barrow, and eventually Manning nodded back.
Yeah, all right,
he said. As they were filing out of the mess, Collins fell into step next to Rollins.
You might want to, tip Barrow off that the natives are getting restless, yeah?
He suggested with a meaningful look in the direction of Manning's back.
Yeah,
Rollins agreed. The next morning at dawn, they assembled outside the barn in full kit. Last night's drill practice had gone a bit better than the morning one, and this time they all managed to line up neatly on the first try.
Squad!
They all snapped to attention, even Plank.
Eyes right! They saluted the tree that stood between the barn and the ruined house, designated Captain Oak for the purpose. Form 4s! The back row took a step backward, the first part of the Form 4s maneuver. Right! This was the magic trick. Everyone, in both rows, had to turn to the right, and simultaneously, every second man had to step to the side and then forward. The way it went wrong was if anyone forgot which group he was in. This time, everybody managed to remember. More or less. Perkins, who was standing next to Plank, had to throw an elbow to keep him where he was supposed to be. Slow march! They set out. The effect was rather spoiled, of course, by the fact that all they were doing just now was going to the dressing station for breakfast, like they did every morning. Still, for a moment, it was fairly grand. The day's march, however, was fairly dull, the only thing that passed for excitement provided by a couple of occasions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, when Thomas spotted an approaching staff car. As they were in the combat zone, they weren't expected to halt and salute, but the wardmaster had warned him that some particularly bloody-minded buggers on the general staff weren't above stopping a unit on the march to berate them for sloppy marching order. Officer up ahead! Thomas warned. Everybody look sharp! He turned around and marched backwards for a moment, an NCO skill he was trying to pick up as quickly as he could, to review his section. Manning, Perkins, button your coats! They buttoned them, and the staff car passed without incident. There was no way to tell, of course, whether that was because they were doing well, or because the staff officer inside had better things to do. About a mile out from the CCS, Thomas called one last halt. Check your uniforms, and if you can't get through the next half hour without a smoke, do it now. I do not want to see any cigarettes the rest of the march. Plank, button your top button, and I swear to God if it isn't fucking buttoned when we get there, I will sew it to your neck! Plank gulped and buttoned his top button. We're moving out again in a quarter-hour sharp. Fall out. They fell out, some sitting down and getting out their cigarettes, some retiring behind a convenient bush. Thomas sat down on the cleanest patch of ground he could find and lit up. You're going to give yourself a heart attack, Rollins observed, sitting beside him. You really think anybody's going to be looking the moment we get there to see if Plank's got his top button done up or not? They might, Thomas answered. They might have a squad of estaminet girls ready to welcome us with whiskey and kisses, but I don't think it's likely, Rollins said. Surprise inspection is probably a bit more likely than that, Thomas pointed out. A bit, Rollins agreed, but he sounded skeptical. Thomas felt vindicated, therefore, when upon reaching the CCS and identifying themselves at the sentry post, they were directed to a nearby square to wait for the sergeant. Thomas had them line up in 2 ranks, a maneuver that required reversing 4 forms, and then kept them standing at ease while they waited. It was only about 10 minutes until the sergeant approached. An older bloke with a regular army look to him. Squad, hup! He said, and they all snapped to attention, Thomas included. The sergeant looked them over, nodding a bit at the end of it. Stand easy! He beckoned Thomas out of line. You're the lot from the 47th? Yes, Sergeant. He nodded. You'll find that Colonel Otley runs a tighter ship than you're used to. Yes, Sergeant. You saying your old CMO runs a sloppy operation, Corporal? No, Sergeant. Our Master Sergeant mentioned that the CMO here has different priorities than Major Thwaite. The sergeant gave him a nod that Thomas had no trouble recognizing as grudging approval. It reminded him of Carson. Barracks inspection at 1700, followed immediately by parade and uniform inspection. You're in Hut C3. Dismissed. Thomas had to find somebody less intimidating to ask where Hut C3 was, but once he had, it wasn't hard to find. It was a purpose-built army hut of the kind they used for wards back at the 47th, weather-tight and conveniently near the main buildings of the station. Things were looking up already. Going inside, they found a barracks with actual bunks. It was one big room, not divided up the way the wards were, and had room for a full platoon. About half the places were occupied, so there might be another new section arriving after theirs. The men from the other 2 sections were busy stowing their kit, making up their bunks, or polishing their boots and brass. You are the sergeant, Thomas told his section. I'll check at 16:30 to see how we're coming along.
They moved toward the back half of the barracks. The first two sections had taken the places in front, and Thomas had just set his pack down on a bunk when someone popped out of a doorway he hadn't seen and said, "Corporal, we're in it." Oh, right. NCOs bunked separately normally. Good thing he hadn't gotten any further into settling in. "Thanks," he said, picking up his kit again.
Long march?
The other corporal asked sympathetically. "All day," Thomas said. The NCO's room had 4 bunks stacked on top of each other to make room for a couple of desks. The other 2 had already chosen the upper bunks, so Thomas dropped his stuff on one of the lower ones.
"I'm Blythe,"
the first corporal said. "And he's Leighton." He indicated with a jerk of his head the man who was lying on one of the bunks. "Barrow," said Thomas. Leighton lowered the book he was reading.
"Which lot are you then?"
Blythe explained.
They said we're getting a section from a field ambulance and one from an ADS.
"Oh, we're the field ambulance, the 47th.
"Our section is first from Blighty."
Blythe went on as Thomas got started making up his bunk.
Leighton's transferred over from the 9th station area, and I was already here.
"That's good," Thomas said. "Give us the lay of the land, then." Blythe described the layout of the station, which had not been precisely what Thomas had in mind, but he supposed it was useful information in any case. He also observed that while Blythe made a brave effort to talk like a soldier, sprinkling in the occasional bloody, for instance, his vowels gave him away as what the wardmaster would term a punchbugger. Leighton didn't talk as much, which made him harder to peg, but Thomas suspected he was the same. At least neither of them was thick enough to ask him where he'd been to school. His bunk made up and his kit stowed, Thomas wiped the dust of the road off his boots and went back into the main room to see if anyone had started a brew-up. Nobody had, so he collected the kettle, spirit stove, and tea, the section's communal property having been distributed among them for the journey, and started one. When the tea was up, and the men started coming over to fill their mugs, he noticed the men from the other 2 sections looking on hopefully, but ignored them. The kettle only held enough for themselves anyway. Thomas sat on Rollins' footlocker drinking his tea and having a smoke. The others eyed him warily for a moment or two, but soon enough got back to what they were doing, talking around him, like they always had. A bit later, the other section arrived.
All right,
a familiar voice said in a tone of one much harassed.
"Stow your shite, you can sightsee later. We've got a fucking inspection to get ready for."
It was Rouse! His corporal's stripes restored. Thomas raised a hand in greeting as he came past, heading for the last section of unoccupied bunks.
"Barrow!" he said. "How the hell have you been?"
"No bad," Thomas said, angling his shoulder so that Rouse could see his stripes.
"Fuck me blind, when did that happen?"
"Tuesday afternoon." He stood up and pointed the way to their room. "We're in here."
"But this is a step up from your barn,"
Rouse observed as they made their way to the NCO's room.
"Several,"
said Thomas. He'd told Rouse about the barn when they were at the aid post.
"Turns out it was structurally unsound. Roof could have fallen down on top of us any time. That's why we're here. They needed a place to put us until it's fixed."
Tossing things onto the bunk, Rouse said,
"Your section's the lot from the barn? Better off being put in charge of your mates."
"It's going all right so far. What about yours?"
He can't have been their corporal for long, since he hadn't been one when they were at the aid post.
"Better than half of them I just met this morning," Rouse said. "I've got a few from my ADS and a few from each of the ones to either side."
"That's a bit rough too," Thomas said. "They say the CMO here is kind of a hard ass."
"I informed that fucking impression, thanks. What did that sergeant have to say about your lot?"
So Rouse's section's initial inspection hadn't gone as smoothly as his. Thomas hesitated a moment before saying,
"Not much, but our wardmaster gave me the heads up about the CMO. We've been getting ready. You?"
"Lines ragged, greatcoats unbuttoned, brass dull boots not shiny enough." "All that shite. How we're meant to fix all that in less than an hour, I couldn't fucking tell you."
Blythe, from his bunk, observed,
"You best pray Colonel Ottley doesn't come now to inspect us. If it's just Sergeant McAllister, you might escape alive."
"That's Blythe," Thomas introduced him, "and the other one's Leighton. He's Rouse."
"Charmed,"
said Leighton, not looking up from his book.
"You chaps know each other?"
Blythe asked.
"Yeah,"
said Rouse. Thomas would have elaborated, but Rouse didn't seem to want to, so he followed his lead.
"I could ask my lads to give yours a hand if you like.
I think we're pretty well squared away. Rouse considered a moment.
Nah, they can take us as we come.
That didn't seem wise to Thomas, but Rouse has presumably been a corporal for something longer than 3 days, counting his prior experience. So Thomas didn't argue. When he went back out to the main room at 16:30, he found everyone mostly ready.
All right, who knows where you're supposed to stand for a barracks inspection?
Thomas hoped somebody did because he did not. They'd had tent inspections in training, but there wasn't room for everybody to stand in there while it was being inspected.
Next to the footlocker, I think,
Rollins said. That sounded about right to Thomas, but when nobody confirmed it, he asked the other 2 sections.
Do any of you lot know?
One of the new lads, who had been watching them with interest, said,
It's to the left of the footlocker, Corporal. Thanks. All right, let's try it.
Nobody moved for a moment. Thomas sighed and said, "Huh!" They all got up and stood by their footlockers.
Left is the other one, Plank.
He moved. Thomas looked them over.
Not bad. Rollins, wipe off your boots. Perkins and Collins, you too. If you've been on your bunk since you made it, remember to pull it tight before the sergeant gets here.
They were all correctly made, but some of them were rumpled.
I'll put the tea stuff away. Whose turn is it to sweep the floor?
They did periodically perform this task in the barn, but there wasn't an official rota. Eventually, Applegate said,
I'll do it. Good. Plank, do you remember what I said about your top button?
It was currently buttoned, but a lot could happen in half an hour.
Yes, Cop. All right. If there's anything else wrong, we'll find out about it together. As you were.
Thomas dithered for a moment over where to put the tea things. There was plenty of room in his footlocker, but that might seem like he was claiming it as his own. There were a couple of extra bunks left over after theirs, so he decided to put it all in the locker to one of those. That finished, he sat down on the locker and smoked a cigarette. With 5 minutes before the sergeant was expected, the other 3 corporals came out of their room. Blythe and Lighton went to stand with their sections, and Rouse swore and raced around helping his frantically finish stowing their gear and straightening up their uniforms.
Look sharp, Thomas told his. Plank, your bunk. Manning, get rid of that cigarette.
Plank straightened down his bunk, and Manning chucked his cigarette into the wood stove. At 1700 on the dot, the door banged open, and Sergeant McAllister came in. They all snapped to attention, and Thomas felt a bit ill. The result of the first section's inspection was not encouraging. Half of their bunks were incorrectly made, several of their greatcoats improperly folded. Thomas had forgotten that there was a correct way to do it. And once he'd finished shouting about all that, Sergeant McAllister opened the footlockers of the worst offenders and shouted about those. Rouse's group was next. The sergeant was working his way down the right-hand side of the barracks and would presumably then work his way up the left side, and they fared even worse. From unpolished boots and unbuttoned tunics to poorly made beds and personal articles not properly stowed, no one escaped. What was worse was that Rouse, when McAllister got to him, tried to argue the point, saying,
Up at the advanced dressing stations, we've got other things to worry about, Sergeant.
That got him a full minute and a half of uninterrupted shouting, including several swear words that Thomas had never heard spoken aloud before. Then McAllister wheeled on Thomas and said,
What about you? Have you got better things to worry about at the 47th Ambulance?
Unable to think of a good answer to that question, Thomas kept his eyes front and said,
Sergeant?
The sergeant huffed and moved on. They got the expected tongue lashing over the greatcoats. Out of all of them, only Manning had his folded correctly, but he found nothing else to find fault with. The final section went much the same as the first, and at the end of it, McAllister announced they'd be doing this again at 5:30 tomorrow morning.
And if fucking necessary, every morning until you buggers get it right.
Then he marched them outside and put them through about a quarter of an hour of saluting drill. Rouse's group again got the worst of it, but Thomas's section came in for their share as well, particularly Rollins, who had trouble remembering to keep his elbow up. The first 2 sections, having just come from training, were much more practiced. At the end of it all, McAllister arranged them by sections, with the new lads at the front, Thomas's section 3rd, and Rouse's 4th. It was not a massive surprise when, moments after they completed this maneuver, a staff car pulled up and disgorged a colonel and his adjutant. This was clearly the moment McAllister had been rehearsing them for, and they managed, on his order, a crisp salute in near perfect unison. Rollins even had his elbow up. Colonel Utley went on to inspect the troops, pausing to speak to each corporal in turn. Blythe heard about the poor posture of several of his men, barely detectable to Thomas's eye, and that several of them had been a fraction of a second behind on their salutes. Lytton was reminded that each rank of 4 should be ordered by height, and that at attention they were to keep eyes front unless directed otherwise. He delivered these corrections in a tone of false jocularity that set Thomas's teeth on edge. You could only imagine what Rouse was making of it.
He said when he got to Thomas. "You're the chaps from the 47th Ambulance." "Yes, sir. Not as bad as I was expecting, but you seem to be missing a man." "So?" "Major Thwaite said he was sending a section. Did you lose one on the way?"
Oh, this was fucking perfect.
"No, sir. Private Lamble was killed several months ago. Enemy action. Haven't had a replacement. Sir."
As Thomas had expected, that set Colonel Utley back on his heels a bit.
"I see,"
he said and moved on. Thomas wasn't sure if seeing him take it down a peg helped Rouse hold on to his temper, but he did get through his own little chat without calling the colonel a gobshite, so that was all to the good. The colonel concluded his inspection by telling the sergeant in a voice meant to carry that he looked forward to see them all drill a week from Sunday. As soon as he'd gotten back into the car and fucked off, McAllister told them all that their inspection the next morning was now scheduled for 5 o'clock, to be followed by drill until breakfast. Then the sergeant buggered off as well, and they trooped back into the barracks in higher spirits than Thomas would have expected, given the ordeal they just went through.
Barrow,
Manning said, clamping him on the shoulder.
"You've been a bit of a wanker these last few days, but now I remember why we love you. Enemy action, sir!" He clicked his heels and made a mock salute.
Thomas shrugged a little.
"Was one of your section really killed in action?"
Asked one of the new lads.
"Yes," Thomas said. "Bringing in a wounded from no man's land."
"Fuck," said Lytton.
"Barrow went out and got him,"
Rollins added. The other corporals got their other sections to work on fixing the deficiencies Sergeant McAllister had informed them of.
"It was my fault about the coats,"
Thomas told his.
"I forgot all about how they want us to fold them."
"And now he's back to being a wanker again,"
Manning said.
"It's lucky he was, though,"
Perkins pointed out with a glance over his shoulder at Rouse's lot.
"Or we'd have come off a lot worse."
"What do you mean, look?"
Thomas objected.
"That's why I was doing it."
They all looked around in confusion.
"You knew that was going to happen?"
Applegate asked.
"Not exactly," Thomas answered, "but the wardmaster said the CMO here was like that. I told you," he reminded them.
"When?" asked Collins.
"Oh," said Rollins, "you know what he did? It was right before all that stuff about not fucking the nurses."
There were murmurs of agreement.
"What, did you not think I was running drills at the crack of dawn for fun?"
For a moment, nobody said anything.
"No," Manning said unconvincingly.
"Yeah, you did,"
Blank pointed out.
"Remember, you said he'd gone mad with power."
"Christ, why didn't somebody say something?" Thomas asked. Rollins said,
"That's kind of what I was working up to when I asked if you were going to lighten up when we got here. But you seemed kind of keyed up, so..."
He probably hadn't wanted Thomas shouting at him and telling him to fuck off again. Still, it was kind of impressive that they'd gone along with Thomas's plans as willingly as they had, if they thought it was all his own idea.
"I figured none of us had so much as thought about drill since we got to the 47th, he explained. "Since I sure as fuck hadn't. I had to borrow a drill manual to figure out what to do."
I got a bit of a chuckle out of that. "I thought you just knew all that stuff," Perkins said.
I remembered the bit about the coats,"
Manning admitted.
"I should have said something."
"Well, show us now,"
Thomas suggested.
"Hang on, let me get mine."
Barrow didn't look a bit like his brother, but Rouse had noticed, when they were at the front together, that every now and then there'd be a moment when he reminded him so much of Fritz that it hurt. Watching him work with his men on how to fold a coat was one of those times. He was a bit more high and mighty in his manner. Fitz had somehow made it seem like whatever he was telling you, you'd have thought of it yourself in a minute or two. Rouse had no idea how he'd managed it, and it didn't look like Barrow knew either. But the way he stepped back and had the Manning bloke show them how the coats were supposed to be folded, That was something Fritz would have done. So was the way, once he'd been shown the trick of it, Barrow did his perfectly, and utterly seriously, as though a thing like how many buttons showed when your coat was on the shelf actually mattered. And when one of Rouse's men in fact, they were watching the lesson as keenly as Barrow's ones were, said something about it being an awful lot of bother for something that didn't make a difference, Rouse knew exactly what he'd say.
Once you get the hang of it, it won't take any longer to do it properly.
How many times had he heard Fitz say that, and about how many things? He was always right, was the bugger of it. Rouse had spent just enough time in the mines before the grammar school scholarship that got him up above ground for good to learn that the men like that, the ones who made doing it right look just as easy as doing it wrong, were the ones you looked to when the bad air came up or when the props started to creak. He hadn't been down the pit long enough to learn how you got to be one of those men. That he'd learned from Fitz. You did it by treating everything like it was important, at least until you knew for goddamn sure that it wasn't. So Rouse swallowed his pride, and when they'd finished fucking about with their coats, asked Barrow,
"You not mind giving us a hand after all?"
Fitz probably would have had something to say that would leave Rouse smarting less for the thrashing he'd gotten on the parade ground. Barrow didn't, but he didn't rub it in either. Just nodded once and began putting his men where he wanted them.
Applegate, Camden, Rollins, would you mind walking those three, he pointed, through sorting out their bunks. Plank, let's see if you remember what I showed you about buttons.
By supper time, Rouse's section wasn't ready for their next inspection, but they at least had some idea of what they still had to do after they ate. As they walked over to the mess, Rouse said to Barrow,
"Fritz was good at all that too."
"What, sewing?" Barrow asked. Right before they'd left, he'd been helping one of Rouse's men with a tear in his tunic.
"No, I mean, yeah, that too. Motivating people is what I meant."
"I'm not good at that," said Barrow.
"And I thought I told you I can't talk about him."
"He said that at the front, sure. A moment's distraction could cost lives there. But they weren't at the front now."
"Whatever!"
Barrow shook his head.
"All right."
Rouse wasn't sure that was a good thing. Remembering hurt, sure, but you had to let the pain out sometime, didn't you?
"It's just that I knew him too. Not as well as you did, of course, but... Would you please shut the fuck up?"
Rouse shut the fuck up. Their boots crunched across the frost-covered grass.
"Sorry,"
Barrow said.
"I just... can't."
"All right," Rouse said again. If he didn't want to talk about it, that was his own lookout. But he decided he was going to keep an eye on Barrow, he decided, for Fitz's sake.